who is one of our members of the Undergraduate Prison Education Partnership, to introduce the speakers. Thank you, Jihye.
Thank you so much, Professor Lackey. Hello, everyone. My name is Jihye Choi, and I'm the events chair for the Undergraduate Prison Education Partnership. And I'll be also handling the audience Q&A portion towards the end of the event. So if you guys have any questions for the panelists at any time during the event, please direct message me at Jihye Choi using the chat function below. If your question is selected, I will ask you to turn on your microphones to ask your question directly to the panelists. So please be ready for that. And I will now introduce today's speakers. So Evie Litwok is the founder and executive director of Witness to Mass Incarceration, which places formerly incarcerated women and LGBTQ+ folks at the forefront of the movement to end mass incarceration. Stephen Dillon is the Associate Professor of Critical Race and Queer Studies at Hampshire College. He is the author of Fugitive Life, The Queer Politics of the Prison State. His other writings on race, sexuality, feminism, and incarceration have appeared in Radical History Review, Women and Performance, a Journal of Feminist Theory, Cultural Studies, and Critical Methodologies, and the edited collections of Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment, and the Prison Industrial Complex and Active Intolerance, and many more. And next we have Ilan Meyer. He is an American psychiatric epidemiologist, author, professor, and senior scholar for public policy and sexual orientation law at the Williams Institute of UCLA. So without further ado, we will now begin the presentations that our speakers have prepared. First up, we have Evie, and I will spotlight her.
Evie, you're muted.
Am I okay now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
So I want to thank you for inviting me to speak here. It's an honor for me. I am a formerly incarcerated Jewish lesbian and child of 2 survivors of the Holocaust, and those intersections impacted me during my entire, let's call it justice system, to the 20 years I was involved with the legal system. Being a queer person was not only the subject of my arrest and the charging document, but played a huge role in my incarceration and in my reentry. So I was arrested in 1997 at a time when cultural and legislative climate was profoundly homophobic. The Defense of Marriage Act had just passed, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell still existed. So it was the strategy of the US Attorney's Office to use the climate of anti-LGBT legislation to put my lifestyle on trial, hoping the jury would convict an openly queer woman and disregard the truth of whether or not I evaded taxes, which was the allegation. In fact, I don't think the taxes were mentioned during the 1.5-day trial. And the government's key witness received immunity from prosecution, and she was listed as my live-in lover. Not only were we not live-in, we did not live together, and we were never lovers. And that my first experience with the legal system was that lying was a big part of it, was a shock to me. It was a shock to me, particularly coming from a set of parents who loved America because they were liberated from concentration camps, and everything that America did was right. So for my parents to see what went on was very difficult. It took 12 years from the time of my arrest for me to go to trial. They did not want to take my case to trial. And at the time I went to trial and was convicted and sentenced, I was living with my mother, who had great difficulty seeing and hearing, and I was her 24-hour caretaker. And I was packing, rather you unpack for prison and you put everything away. When she, all 4'9" of her, walked in with her walker and said, "I want to talk to you." And this was the night before I was to leave for prison. And she was very serious. And she said, "Prison is going to be harder for you than concentration camp was for me." And I looked at her, I said, "Are you crazy, Mom? You were in Auschwitz. How can you compare the two?" She said, "I was 12 years old, you're 60. And it was years later that when I was in solitary confinement, that my mother's words would come back to me. She said, I was young, a child. I didn't know what was going on. You're an old woman. I wasn't crazy about that. You're an old woman. You've had an entire life and you're going to remember every day what your life was like. And she was right. The moment you enter prison, you know that you're no longer in the free world. Within an hour of my arrival, an officer took me into a cold and dingy room, and I was ordered to strip in front of her. I was ordered to pee in front of her. Then I had to lift my breast so she could check underneath whether I had any contraband. And then she asked me to bend over and cough so she could check my anus and my vagina again for contraband. And in that 10 seconds of being bent over in front of a stranger in this room, I was more humiliated than at any point in my life. I never knew these feelings. And I knew immediately that I had to shut down all feelings and find a set of coping skills that didn't exist, but had to be created immediately. So I was sent to a unit that had a lot of newbies, as we were called, and for the first 2 weeks of prison. And the veterans walk over to you and they send one message, which is if you want to do easy time, and you have to stay under the radar, and you have to make sure that the officers don't know your name, the warden doesn't know your name. Otherwise, it'll be difficult. Well, I'm a baby of the women's gay rights and civil rights movement. Um, I was an old, experienced activist, and I could not just park that activism or check it at the door when I came in. So it took less than an hour for me to literally be on everybody's radar. And this is this is how it happened. People walk over to you. You're allowed to bring in 25 pictures. They want to know who you are. So first woman walks over. Are you married? Do you have children? No, I'm not married. I don't have children. Second woman, are you married? Do you have children? No, I'm not married. I don't have children. And after the fourth woman, I said, Jesus, I've been out for 40 years. I'm not going back in the closet because, I'm in prison. So when the very next person walked over to me and said, are you married? Do you have children? I said, I'm not married. I don't have children. I'm a lesbian. And she said, can I see your pictures? And so I had brought in, 25 pictures of Allie, my dog. So this young woman yells out, this white old lesbian has 25 pictures of her dog. And that was it. I was on everybody's radar. Everybody knew my name, knew my dog's name. And I was in serious, even though I can laugh at this now, I put myself in an extremely dangerous position, very unwittingly. By the way, when I did come out, which was 40 years earlier, my mother said to me, well, if Hitler didn't kill me, you will, which I thought at the time was the funniest, would be the title of a book I would write. So inmate.com spread the word. And by lunch, everybody knew who I was, and I was on everybody's radar. And about a week or 10 days after this, I get called to a very white, racist manager of this unit who could not help herself. She openly said, I don't want any black women in this unit. And if they were new and they'd come through, she'd try to get rid of them as fast as possible. And I understood racism from a completely different perspective within 2 days of being in prison. It changed my mind, or rather it was an education. So she called me into her office and she said, it's come to my attention that you're an open lesbian. And I could feel myself about to get angry and explode. And I said, yes, I'm also an open Jew and I'm an open feminist. And she said, well, it's also come to my attention that you're touching women's buttocks. And it took me a second to know that a buttocks was a tushy, was an ass. And I looked at her and I said, how dare you? I haven't been with a woman in 10 years. You think I'm going to come into prison and start being with one? And I almost crossed over at her desk. I forgot that I was in prison, thought I was in a courtroom, and started to demand my accusers to be brought to me. I want to know who said this. And of course, she might have made it up for all I know, but during your first or second day, you don't know these things. So I was ready to go to court with her when I remembered she's an officer and I'm screaming at her. So she said, go back to your bed, which was maybe 50 feet down a flight of stairs and right over. And my mattress had been rolled up, and she decided to send me to a unit that was called the ghetto. And she put me in a sleeping area called the bus stop. And I was told very specifically that because I openly came out as lesbian, that I would never have a sleeping or work arrangement. And remember, I'm 60 years old when I went to prison. I was released only 5 years ago. So I came in as an older person. The bus stop, so you understand it, is there's a sleeping quarters that has roughly 150 women. Now, I pretend that I'm in the bus stop and there's 10 bunk beds and we're the women being punished. So everybody who's in the sleeping unit is behind us. So at 11, and prison has fluorescent lights wall to wall on every ceiling, and they're designed to give you headaches. Prison is a torture environment, and they prompted people to have seizures, have severe headaches and severe issues, vertigo, as a result. So at 11 o'clock, when they turned these fluorescent lights off in the back, in the sleeping quarters, they left them on right where we were sleeping. And the ceilings are low, so you're literally 5 feet away from a bright light. Right in front of us is an ice machine, which comes crashing down every 20 minutes. And on either side of us were the bathrooms and the showers, which 150 women were using all night. So the purpose of the bus stop was for you not to sleep. And that's what it accomplished. Now, one time they did put me in a location with one other woman who was homophobic and violent. And when I went into that, when I went into the bunk, she looked at me, she said, "You better not sleep, Grandma, because I'll kill you." So, and she was serious. She had a belt in her hand that she was going to hurt me. So I ended up not sleeping for the entire time that I was bunked with her, and having to sleep during the day just to catch up on a little. When I did go to see an officer to ask whether or not I could be moved without telling her the situation, the officer knew the situation. They had intentionally put me there so that I would be harmed. She said to me, "Well, if you're afraid for your life," and I hadn't told her I was afraid for my life, "then I'll put you in solitary." Now understand, they were willing to put me in solitary, but they were unwilling to penalize the woman who they knew was prepared to attack me. When it comes in prison, you have to work. You're forced to work. It's different in state prisons than it is in federal prison. But for most women over the age of 60, they would give you an indoor job where you could mop a floor and then read a book. Again, they told me point blank, because I was a lesbian, I was not going to get one of these indoor assignments. They put me on landscaping, and I was in West Virginia, and it was 90 to 100 degrees almost. We were in the mountains, 90 to 100 degrees every day in July and August. And I was given a broom and told to sweep rocks off the street in this weather. They knew that I had a heart condition, and they knew that I had, both sides of my family had passed away from heart conditions. So everything they did was intentional, because they told me this. They're not shy about saying, if you make it, if you're still alive in an hour, we'll come get you. And this is all because I had the gall to come out. Now, the two things I experienced and saw in prison were the most excessive use of solitary confinement that you can imagine, meaning that solitary had 60 beds and there were 60 women in it at all times, and sexual violence, which I not only experienced, but I watched every day. So typically, and it's open, it's right there for everybody to see. So I saw I had a friend standing next to me. An officer walked over to her. 75% of the women in prison are mothers. And they will, unlike a men's prison that will strike and be outrageous, women will not do anything to jeopardize visitation. They want to see their kids. So they will not strike. They will not do anything that might get in the way of that. So an officer would walk. I'm sorry to be graphic, but it's best for me to really tell you things as they are. So the officer walks over and says, "Do you want to see your kids this weekend?" And she looks at him like, "Of course I do." And he said, "Then I want a blowjob." And now this woman had to do this. Her choices were, if she didn't do it, she was going to go to solitary and would lose the visitation. If she didn't do it and he was nervous, then he was going to transfer her to another, he would have her transferred to another prison, and people in prison are poor. So if she was transferred to another state, she would not see her kids every weekend because they could not afford the travel. So what you had in solitary was a collection of women who either said no to an officer around sexual favors, mostly LGBT people for an abundance of reasons, and people who had slept with officers, but the officers became afraid that they would talk, so they put them into solitary. Now, I want to say that sexual violence in confinement hits the LGBT community the worst. And it's not a subject we talk about enough. If you're a 16-year-old young male and you're going into a men's prison, you're going to be gang raped day one. You're going to be gang raped day two, and you're going to be gang raped until somebody says to you, "I'll be your protector, and I will make sure you don't get gang raped." But in exchange for that deal, this young person has to agree to do whatever the protector wants. Whether the protector wants to have sex 3 times a day, or sell him to somebody else, or give him to somebody else. And many of the men that I work with will look at me and say, when they tell me the stories, and say, "Do you still think I'm a man?" And it breaks my heart to hear these conversations. And men will not talk about this as much as women are capable of talking about it. And what you have to know is trans women are impacted probably worse than anybody on a daily basis. And I will get to that in a second. But in 2003, Congress passed what's called the Prison Rape Elimination Act, Priya. And its primary goal was to prevent harassment, assault, and abuse against inmates. It was a criminal act for an officer, and that's not for anybody, to have sex in prison. 50 standards were created to measure whether prisons, jails, and detention centers were complying. And we sit here 18 years later, and the Priya law and its standards are a joke, because the level of sexual violence in prison, particularly against queer people, is off the charts. I saw it daily. For example, there's a standard where male officers are not allowed to touch female officers, female incarcerated women. That goes on every day. But for a trans person, a trans woman in a men's jail, they get cross-searched sometimes every couple of hours, just because if you have breasts, they really think it's amusing and they obey no laws. Housing standards require that you be aware whether you have an LGBTQ person, and you have to house them, and you have to screen them for housing. My friend Rodney, who's a Black gay man, went before the classification board 4 times. He begged them not to put him in certain locations, and their response to him each time was, "We're not moving you because we think you like this shit." Zahara, a friend who's a trans woman, was forced to shower without a curtain. Now, it's against the trans people are supposed to have separate showers with curtains. And what they made her do is stand in the shower, and men would, and officers as well as incarcerated men would masturbate while she was taking a shower. This stuff really happens. And my organization, Witness to Mass Incarceration, focuses, one of its biggest focus is eliminating sexual violence behind bars, because there's no Me Too movement behind the wall. Now, Ilan will tell you, because this is from a Williams Institute study, that 42% of the women in prison identify as queer, and roughly 10% of the men in prisons and jails, 9 to 10%. I'm sure he can give you much more detailed information. So we are disproportionately abused in prisons, jails, and detention centers. My friend Zahara, a Black trans woman, was being assaulted daily by a man who said, "You're going to be my wife or you're going to be dead." And she had to choose between solitary confinement, which she thought was bad for her mental health, which she knew was bad for her mental health, and dealing with this man every day. So she chose solitary. And when she went into solitary, the officer popped the door to let this man in, and he raped her. This stuff is hard stuff, but it has to be talked about. The Trans Pride Institute, which operates out of Texas, did a study a couple of years ago based on letters they received from in about 2016. There were 1,567 complaints filed by trans women about sexual complaints. Out of the 1,567 complaints, 12 were deemed substantiated. So less than 1% were even looked at. 99% were deemed as unsubstantiated, meaning that they thought 99% of the people were lying. This is how we are dealt with in prison. And my feeling is the Priya Act is a failure. And even though one of my goals is to try to amend the Priya Act, I find that the greatest failure of passing laws is that they're not enforced or funds are not appropriated for them. So we keep passing laws that don't get appropriations and have no regulations. Now to reentry. I'm one of 700,000 people that is released every year. I was sent home with $30 and a bus ticket to New York, where I was homeless and penniless for 16 months. And despite a 30-year work history and sending out 200 job applications, I received not a single response. I knew where to look for resources, and the resources that exist for formerly incarcerated people are transactional in nature. Food, a meal, a MetroCard, a resume, employment training, but nothing transformative, nothing for a person who walks out with nothing to rebuild their life. Housing is all transitional. So you're coming from prison where you live with a bunch of women and shared a bathroom to home where you live with a bunch of women and you're sharing a bathroom. Only it's even more restrictive than prison because you have to attend programs and meetings about nothing that relates to you rebuilding your life. So the models that we have for reentry, and understand that LGBT youth represent 40% of the homeless youth. So LGBT formerly incarcerated youth are at greater risk, and those numbers are worse. So there's a tremendous housing crisis. So what I will tell you is when I was in solitary, it was very hard for me. And when I was in reentry after 16 months, and I felt the same way I did in solitary, which was I looked up at God, and I said, I've had a good life, and it would be really okay if I didn't wake up. And when you're coming out of prison and you've tried everything you can, and you can't get anywhere, and you have to choose between spending 30 cents on a bagel or $1 on a piece of pizza, you're ready to walk in front of, even if you're not a depressed person, even if you're not a suicidal person, which I'm not, you do think about throwing yourself in front of a subway because it's just too hard for us. And what happened for me and what formed Witness is a friend from back in the day. I ran into someone who said, where have you been? And I said, in prison. And she said, you won't stabilize unless you have housing. And she found me the place I'm living at now. And I said, Irv, she's a great leader in the LGBT movement, Irva Shibad, very dear friend. And she said, Ev, you got to take this apartment. I said, I only have my Social Security to live on. I can't get a job. And if I use the Social Security for rent, then I can't eat. She said, I'll find you a job. And within 10 days, she realized she wasn't going to find me a job. Being a convicted felon, being a lesbian, and being old, the combination was not going to get me a job, except maybe at the Gap. And she said, I'm going to give you $1,000 a month for a year. That will pay your bills, you'll pay your rent, and you'll start Witness. That 1 year that she bought me saved my life. All the services put together did nothing for me. The $100 million worth of reentry services that are available didn't do as much as this woman giving me $1,000 a month, who saved my life because she gave me time to breathe. And the basis of Witness, everything I do is with the understanding of what I went through. And queer people need a safety net. And it's one thing to talk about us, but it's urgent that we be helped. Many of my formerly incarcerated brothers and sisters stand beside me, but I want to make a comment which might be difficult, but the queer community has not stood beside us. I'm often a sole voice in a room full of queer activists who are celebrating the victory of same-sex marriage, who are celebrating that they are achieving status and are in boardrooms. And I sit there and I am compelled to raise my hand and say, do you know the level of poverty that queer LGBT people formerly incarcerated are dealing with? And what have you done to help us? And in 5 years that I have raised my hand at countless organizations, I can tell you that no one has ever contacted me or lifted a finger. So part of the problem is our own community not being willing to deal with issues. And I will also say that my synagogue does more to meet and greet people who are coming out than my own queer community. And I'm sorry to have to say that, but incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people suffer greatly, and we need help. We need you to help us to create alternatives to mass incarceration, to demand an end to the barbaric practices in confinement, and to ensure the safety net we need in the free world. We need you to care. Please go to my website. You don't have to donate, subscribe, be just on an email list, so you hear what's going on directly from people, and you maybe watch some of the videos that are very difficult to see. Be part of our army, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Evie. We will now have Stephen give his presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Dillon. I'm a scholar of feminist, queer, and anti-racist activism against incarceration. And I hope my comments complement Evie's by focusing on resistance. And I'm also going to talk about the kind of failure of the gay left a little bit. I'm going to read and talk. So if you want, feel free to think of this, at least my few about 15 minutes of remarks as maybe like a podcast. Feel free to close your eyes or don't look at the screen. We're spending all day looking at screens, so feel free to not do that. So yeah, I want to give you a few snapshots of what queer and trans activism against incarceration looked like in the 70s and 80s, and leave you with some thoughts about abolition. Just to set the scene, The first moment I'm talking about is 1971. New York University has made the decision to not allow there to be a gay dance on their campus. And Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, who founded a group called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and the Gay Liberation Front occupied Weinstein Hall at NYU. And I'm going to talk about how Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson responded to how people were thinking about police and prisons, and then move us forward in time a little bit. Okay, but that's the kind of first snapshot, is there's an occupation at NYU over NYU's decision not to not let people have a queer dance. In their 1971 statement on the occupation of Weinstein Hall at New York University by gay liberation activists, the organization Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or I will call it STAR from now on, asked a profound question concerning the future of movements for sexual and gender liberation. STAR's statement was a response to the abandonment of the occupation by protesters, as they put it, quote, upon the request of the pigs. For STAR, the decision to end the occupation at the request of the police demonstrated an ambivalence at the heart of the gay liberation movement's desire for a different ordering of the world. In their statement, STAR asked, quote, do you really want gay power, or are you looking for a few laughs and maybe a little excitement? We're not quite sure what you people really want. If you want gay liberation, then you're gonna have to fight for it. We don't mean tomorrow or the next day. We're talking about today. We can never possibly win by saying, quote, wait for a better day, or we're not ready yet. If you're ready to tell people that you want to be free, then you're ready to fight. So the question is, do you want gay power or pig power? By asking members of the gay liberation movement if they wanted gay power or pig power, STAR placed a different type of desire at the center of movements for sexual liberation, a desire that deployed sexuality as a critique of the systems of racialized policing central to the 1970s post-civil rights state. Sexual liberation within this analytic wasn't only about the fun and excitement that was content for the present to passively remake itself into a more livable future. The statement, wait for a better day, was an alibi to the intensification of racialized, anti-queer, and anti-trans state violence. STAR couldn't wait for the present to be transformed into a better future because they knew the future looked like the unlivability of the present. Instead, sexual liberation required a politics that saw the police as one of the forces that made the future impossible for queer and trans people. STAR argued that gay liberation had pacified itself by listening to the demands of the police. As they wrote, quote, chalk one up for the pigs, for they truly are carrying their victory flag, and realize the next demonstration is going to be harder because they now know we scare easily. For STAR, the many potential futures of gay liberation lay not in allying with what they called pig power, but in remaining oppositional to systems of racialized policing. As the letter ended, quote, you people run if you want to, but we're tired of running. We intend to fight for our rights till we get them. For STAR, gay power was antagonistic to police power. Indeed, the eradication of what they called pig power was the goal of what they called gay power. But STAR saw this politics waning even a few short years after the uprising against police violence at the Stonewall Inn. STAR warned that the dawn of a new political horizon where queer activists would work with the police, applaud the police, join the police, argue for more police, and demand harsher forms of state power to be enforced by the police. But STAR argued that queer desire didn't have to lead back to the police and the prison. Many other LGBTQ activists, of course, shared STAR's concerns. The editors of the 1980 collection called Top Ranking, a collection of articles on racism and classism in the lesbian community, describe what they saw as an emerging form of racism in the lesbian community in the early 1980s and late 70s. And this is a little bit of a longer quote. Quote, "One way that racism in particular has manifested itself in both the lesbian and feminist community or movements is in some of the strategies devised for addressing violence against women. Of course, a legitimate concern of all women. Some of us have called for more police protection, lesbian police officers, and or participated in discussions with the police, completely disregarding the murder or shooting down of third world women, men, and children by the police, and that the sole purpose of the police is to protect private property and maintain order." Like Starr before them, the editors of Top Ranking worried about how racism was changing the contours and directions of lesbian and queer desire in the era of a dawning prison state. They saw the capture of desire when lesbians and feminists wanted the racial state to protect some lesbians against some forms of homophobic and sexist violence. In other words, lesbianism was going on patrol with the police, even as many others wanted it to make patrolling impossible. Top Ranking catalogs how desire led from a group of lesbians afraid for their lives at the hands of homophobic and patriarchal violence to the expansion of the racial violence of the police. To that end, the contributors of Top Ranking, who include Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith and many others, saw a relationality between systems of power often conceived as discrete under statist or Marxist or feminist or nationalist or lesbian or radical politics. Of course, the title hints at this about racism and classism. In an essay in the collection titled, quote, "Prison Work and the Lesbian Issue," a white lesbian anti-prison activist named Charula responded to lesbians who, quote, felt that, quote, doing prison work is antithetical to the lesbian movement. So Charula's essay is grounded in an analysis of gendered poverty, the racialized regulation of welfare, criminalized survival strategies, and patriarchal violence. And she argued that incarcerated women, quote, know who the enemy is, and the enemy is the same for both lesbians and straight women. I only wish we could acquire the same clear insight in our struggles out here. Charula imagined a lesbian politics that would attack, quote, the state itself by attacking prisons. By attacking the state, she argued, lesbians could launch an autonomous but coalitional movement grounded in what she called the differences among us. In the short term, such a movement could support the resistance and survival of those most vulnerable to racialized and heteropatriarchal state violence. And then in the long term, as she wrote, quote, fighting for women in prison is fighting for our own interests as well, our own survival. In other words, one could not easily separate outside from inside, free from unfree, because the inside possessed the outside and the outside made the inside possible. I'm going to shift now to talking about kind of a conservative turn in LGBTQ politics. In her book, Criminal Intimacy, Prison and the Uneven History of Modern American Sexuality, Regina Kunzel charts the forced forgetting of imprisoned LGBTQ people by free world queer activist communities. By looking at mainstream gay and queer left publications, Kunzel notes a transition from a politics of solidarity with imprisoned queer and trans people in the 1970s to a position of distance and disidentification beginning in the 1980s. The 1980s saw a broader shift where activism became a profession enshrined in the nonprofit. According to Kunzel and the queer theorists Merle Beam and Dean Spade, this professionalization of activism dramatically shaped how we imagine what we want, what we need, and what tomorrow should look like. The impossible demands of the 60s and 70s, bring the war home, Free our sisters, free ourselves, free all political prisoners, gay liberation now, we cannot live without our lives, became supplanted in the 1980s by a bureaucracy of the practical: marriage, insurance, retirement, inclusion in the military and police, criminal justice reform, hate crimes laws, and so on. In addition, funders and foundations started determining the work activists would take on. Kunzel notes that in the 70s, queer activists connected their experiences of personalized and institutionalized racism and homophobia with the struggles of imprisoned people. Quote, in the words of one free world activist, because we understand that the system that has created and maintained prisons as a method of social control is the same system that oppresses those of us on the outside. This liberatory queer politics was not concerned with giving prisoners, quote, a helping hand. It rather sought to build, quote, a new kind of community that could challenge the racialized politics of criminality, systems of social control and bodily regulation, and the larger management of queer and trans desire. In the 80s, Kunzel marks a decline in prison pen pal projects and a shift from a revolutionary politics to a liberal politics bent on social inclusion, rights, and gay marriage. Many queer activists shifted their concerns to what they called winnable battles, where queer prisoners were constructed as, quote, a negative element in the overall debate concerning gay rights. So gay activists sought to build a movement with what they said was as little fragmentation as possible. Middle-class gay white men argued that gay rights should remain a legislative issue and that, quote, legally sanctioned gay marriage should be a primary concern for all of us. So Kunzel charts the ways that the forced forgetting of queer and trans imprisoned people was central to the coalescing of new gay norms that would emerge in the 1990s, a politics of gay respectability, and what many queer theorists call homonormativity. Importantly, this disciplining of the queer left was a racialized project that coalesced around shoring up the privileges afforded by whiteness, gender normativity, and capital by sacrificing a politics that sought freedom for all, or even something more practical like universal healthcare. I'm gonna end with a quote from the philosopher Michel Foucault. He's kind of one of the big theorists of incarceration. What's lesser known about him is that he spent 15 years as an activist on the street. He'd stand on the street handing out pamphlets about prisons in France. And I'm gonna end with a quote from him that's from some soon to be published papers from his anti-prison activism. Interviewer is gonna ask him if he can think of like an ideal prison, like a perfect prison. And I'm gonna read his response and end with his response. In 1972, Michel Foucault was asked, quote, do you know of a model prison? He responded, quote, the problem is not a model prison or even the abolition of prisons. Currently, in our system, marginalization is affected by prisons. This marginalization will not automatically disappear by abolishing the prison. Society would quite simply institute another means. The problem is the following: to offer a critique of the system that explains the process by which contemporary society pushes a portion of the population to the margins. Voila, end quote. In Foucault's formulation, the prison is more than an institution composed of cages, corridors, and guard towers. It is, of course, that. But it is also a system of feelings, desires, discourses, and ideas that make those things possible. In other words, the prison captures not just people or bodies, but also our feelings, our hopes, our ideas of the future, and our forms of knowledge. In other words, the prison could disappear tomorrow for Foucault, and the types of power that give rise to its reign would live on in other forms. In other words, the work for us all and the question for us all is how to end the prison as well as systems of marginalization. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We will now hand it over to Ilan.
Yes, hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this. You're getting not only a different perspectives, but whole different orientations to knowledge, which is really wonderful to be part of. I'm a psychiatric epidemiologist, so I deal with the numbers mainly, but also the ideas that the numbers present to us. So I will share with you a PowerPoint presentation because I want to share some data on our study of incarceration in sexual and gender minorities. And the data that I would present is based on several papers with these collaborators. And I'm going to talk about it very briefly, but anybody who's interested in more is welcome to send me an email. So the data source is really interesting. This is data that was actually mandated by the Priya, the law that Evie mentioned. Part of Priya, there's a whole range of Priya requirements. Part of it is to conduct studies that look at sexual violence in prisons and jails. And this particular data set provided by the government, although it is conducted by a university entity in contract with the government, is actually a really wonderful resource because for the first time we have a representative sample of inmates in all facilities, as you can see, state and federal prisons, jails, and other facilities. We also did a study of youth in custody. I'm not going to get into that now, but we have data on that as well. And the study itself is based on interviews, not by prison personnel or anything like that, but as I said before, by the research entity that has been contracted to do this. And I'm going to talk about two types of populations. The first group is what I call Lgbt, and this is people who said in response to this question that they are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, as opposed or as in contrast with straight or heterosexual. The other group I'm calling men who have sex with men or women who have sex with women. And those are people who said that they are straight, but when asked about their sexual experience, sexual activity, and it's important to note here, prior to entering the prison or jail where they were interviewed at. So this is not talking about people who have same-sex experiences while they're incarcerated, but people who before entering this prison or jail had sexual relationship with same-sex partners. So this particular group, I'm calling them MSM MWSW, which means they're men who had sex with men, but are not gay or bisexual identified. And the same thing for the women who have sex with women, but are not lesbian or gay or bisexual identified. So again, the most important part of it, this is a representative sample of US incarcerated individuals. And the first finding that we had, and again, this is something that advocates have noticed even before our findings, but we are the first to actually have numbers. And what we've seen is that sexual minorities are overrepresented in prisons and jails. This is for men. So there's greater overrepresentation in prisons and slight overrepresentation in jails, compared to, on the right side here, you have the US population sexual minority men, so that's 3.6%. This was in 2011 when this data was collected. And I could have a whole other talk about how to get this data, which was very, very hard and took me 3 years of being very persistent and fighting with Bureau of Justice Statistics, because they're the ones who hold the data. Although it has been, it is described as public data set, it is not very public. In women, this is even much more astounding in my mind. And what we found is that 35% of women in jails and 42% of women in prisons are sexual minorities. That is 10 times more than what it is in the general population. So what this tells us is that lesbians, bisexuals, and gay people are targeted for incarceration in the United States. When we calculated some other proportions there, the rate of incarceration per 100,000 is 1,882 for LGBT people. This doesn't include those MSM and WSW. And that rate is 3 times that of the US population for adults over age 18, which is 612. So, and as you know, the US has the highest rate of incarceration of the entire rest of the world. So within that context, LGBT people are at much more likely to be incarcerated. In terms of the demographics compared with the straight men, both again bisexual men and the MSM were older, and they're actually less likely to be Black and Hispanic. Of course, you know that in general, men in prisons and jails are more likely to be Black and Hispanic than they are in the general population. And among women, they were younger and they were more likely to be Black and other non-Hispanic and non-white races. And that was true for the lesbian and bisexual women. So now I'm going to show you some of the things that you've already heard about, but again, showing you some numbers. And this is just looking at the data from prisons. And as I said, the data is very similar when you look at jails, but they're separate data sets. And we have both. So looking at women and prisons, what you see here is the lesbian, bisexual women in the darker color and straight women in the lighter color. And I wanted to particularly look at, so this is the reason why they're incarcerated. What was the cause of this incarceration? And I wasn't particularly surprised by the designation of violence to these women compared to straight women. So that they were 2.9 compared to 1.6% more likely to be in prison because of violent sexual offenses or other sexual offenses compared to straight women. And the same thing was true with men, although much more likely to be incarcerated due to violent sexual offenses, and the column on the left, compared to other. Other would be drug and parole violations mostly. So that to me was really a stunning finding, because I'm a psychiatric epidemiologist, but I'm also a sociologist and social psychologist. And the notion that sexual minorities are more likely to be incarcerated because of violent sexual crimes rang all kinds of bells in terms of what explains that. Why are we seeing that? And this is now the topic of my current studies, which I would share with you at the end, looking in particular at the quote unquote violent sexual offenses. But in terms of their experiences in prisons, in jails, LGBT people were, as you see on the left in the dark blue is gay, bisexual men, more likely to be assaulted by staff, and among the women, also more likely to be assaulted by staff. So this is on the left side here. And assaults by inmate are also more likely to be targeted LGBT people. So that wasn't a complete surprise because BJS has already published data similar to that. Well, what's surprising to me is that LGBT people are more likely to be more severely punished. So they have longer sentences than straight individuals. And again, the two left columns are for gay, bisexual men and straight men. And the two right columns are for lesbian, bisexual women and straight women. And in each group, the sexual minority group has more likely to have longer than 20 years prison sentence. And they're more likely to be in solitary segregation. As Evie mentioned, solitary segregation for LGBT people is used in sometimes as punishment and sometimes as quote unquote protection. So when a person is complaining of sexual violence or any other violence or attacks, they're protected by being, from the prison's perspective, protected by being in solitary segregation, which is of course the same as punishment for solitary segregation. It's the same conditions. There's no, in most prisons, there's no better condition because you're there for your protection. And as you can see, LGBT people are also more likely to suffer mental health consequences. This is measured as psychological distress, which are symptoms of anxiety and depression while they're incarcerated. And you can see, again, the differences from left to right, gay bisexual men, 29%, versus straight men, 14%, and lesbian bisexual women, 25% compared to 19%. So of course, prison is difficult for everybody, but again, we see that it is harsher in terms of its impact on mental health for LGBT people. An interesting thing, which I would like us to maybe discuss later, is consensual sex with an inmate. So we had a hard time defining consensual sex, and prisons would tell you that they can't define it because you know, you never know if there's real consent when you're in a prison situation. However, some research, not this, this is just giving us this information, what the inmate said in this confidential interview to the interviewer, they said it was consensual. And what we see here is that, again, sexual minorities are a lot more likely to report having consensual sexual relationship in prisons. And the same thing is in jails. And the reason that this is important is because this is widely misunderstood. So on one hand, you can say there's no consent in prison, even with another inmate, because there could be a lot of violence, etc. And I understand that. On the other hand, it is also, as I said, reported that people have had meaningful sexual and emotional relationships with other inmates. And where this comes back to the Priya is because of Priya, this can actually lead LGBT people to be penalized using Priya that was supposed to protect them, because now they're the violators of the Priya no sex in prison or jail and get punished for that. And what we know also from anecdote is that transgender women in particular can get punished under Priya for, let's say, wearing rouge or lipstick, because that is seen as sexual advances. So that's kind of a whole interesting area that we don't often talk about in terms of LGBT people in prisons and jails. In terms of reporting of sexual assault, very few people report it. And that was true of both straight and LGBT people. The reasons for not reporting included being afraid, but for the sexual minority male victims, they were afraid of other inmates, lacking in expectations that there would be punishment against the perpetrator if they were to report it, and being ashamed or embarrassed. And for the female victims, it was mostly that they were embarrassed or ashamed. Those are the highest, the most reported reasons for not reporting sexual victimization. So in short, the sexual victimization that were reported in this interview to the researchers, most of them go unreported to the administrators. And so when you look at administrative data, you will find only the tip of the iceberg on that. Now, I want to say a few words on the gender identity and why I didn't include transgender people in the data we just showed. And that has to do with the problems with the measurements in this data set, the National Inmate Survey. The respondents, people were asked, are you male, female, or transgender? This is a problematic question because it doesn't capture people who say, I'm a woman, but a transgender woman, but don't identify as transgender. But more significant than that was that the data set, as you know, people are housed in primarily male or female facilities. And in the data set, they basically recoded, if you said I'm a woman and you were in a male prison, they recoded your gender to be male. They assumed there was a mistake or assumed there was wrong. So we didn't want to rely on this data. We highlighted it for the RTI, the research group that is conducting the survey, and asked them to make changes to this measure. So that's why I didn't present the data. And what we see using the transgender data that they did include was actually somewhat underrepresented. But again, as I said, any person who identifies as a woman would not be counted here. And we had serious concerns about the measure that identified who is transgender. Regardless of that, we've seen, again, as is known, that transgender inmates were a lot more likely to have been assaulted by staff, assaulted by inmate. They're also more likely to have consensual sex, were more likely to be in solitary segregation, and to experience psychological distress. So I don't want to get into summary. There's a lot of issues, as I mentioned, with data, and there's a lot of issues with data access. As I said, I had the research to spend 3 years, including hiring a law firm to try to get this data, but most researchers are not able to do that. In terms of user research, as I said, I'm very interested in the pathways that lead to incarceration. So what we're saying that LGBT people are overrepresented, why are they targeted? Or not so much why, we kind of know why, that I think has to do with stigma and prejudice and the kind of associations that have when you're a sexual minority in terms of what behavior get called upon by society in general. But I'm in particular interested in the sexual violent crimes. And I have a study, and we have a report that we just completed on civil commitment of sexual violent crimes. And civil commitment is a really dark area of this whole justice system, where a person is determined to be high risk upon finishing their sentence. So they finished sometimes 10, 15, 25 years term, and then are assigned to civil commitment, which is practically the same. They're basically continuing to be incarcerated. And supposedly, because they get treatment, which they often don't get, that is legal. And what we found in our survey, that in our paper that I would post on the chat group, is even there, sexual minorities are more likely to be determined, to be deemed sexually violent, and therefore be in the civil commitment. and there's some reasons for that that I won't get into. But one example of how sexual minorities are targeted through sexual violence or alleged sexual violence is, for example, if you think about Romeo and Juliet laws that allow for some sexual relationship between people of similar age group, even though one of them is a minor. So let's say a girl is 15 and a boyfriend is 18, and that is illegal, but within the law, there's allowance for that. It's less of a punishable by less than if there was a greater age group. But what I'm concerned with is, imagine that this happened if between a man and a woman, a young man or woman and an older man or woman in these age groups, like 3 years apart, or between two men or two women. Now, who do you guess is more likely to be, and what situation are the police more likely to be called? And the answer is when they're same-sex partners. The parents are going to be alarmed, the community is going to be alarmed, that person is going to get into a lot of trouble that if it was a straight relationship, they wouldn't have been. And it's probably true for a lot of other types of instances. So with that, I would, and if you have an interest, you are welcome to email me at meyer@law.edu, at .ucla.edu, and I will post a couple of the studies that I mentioned in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Well, we will now begin our audience Q&A section. So our first question is from Austin. Austin, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much to all three of you. It was really insightful and you brought a lot of different perspectives and I really appreciated it. I just wanted to say that. But my question is just kind of general. So all three of you touched on the fact that queer people continue to experience high rates of incarceration and experience worse conditions in prison, even as general laws and general public opinions on queer people continues to shift over the decades. So this is sort of a broad question, but what mechanisms would you say are at the center of that? Like what mechanisms are at the center of that continued trend?
Are you directing that question to anybody?
Sorry, that was just a general one for anyone who wants to.
I would, okay, so I probably look at prison a little differently than my other panelists coming from the inside. I think that you have to look at prison as a place that has been used by those in power. I mean, I hate to boil it down to, it's about racism. It's about marginalization. It's about putting people away who you can put away because it's so easy to put them aside. You have to understand, and while we appear to be decarcerating prisons, what you need to understand is there are 2.3 million people in prison, but we are now shifting from mass incarceration to mass supervision or correctional control. And there are 6 million, but anywhere between 4.5 to 6 million people. You have double the number of people. So we've gone from slavery to mass incarceration, and we are now heading on, we are well past the point of stopping the next form of prison. And who's in there? People of color. Who's in there? LGBT people of color. You can say anything you want to say, but the numbers speak for themselves. If I might hit a point that's not related to your question, if nobody minds, I want to make a point on violence, violent crime. If you have, I work with women who were incarcerated when they were 17, Black women, Black lesbians. There was in a room with 12 people and one person committed a murder, and they all went to prison and they're all called violent offenders. One person did it, but everybody went to prison for life. if I committed a murder in a room full of white teenagers, I probably wouldn't go to prison for life, and everybody else would be sent home on their parents, with their parents. So this system is not about whether it's accurately called violent. So violent crime is overestimated fivefold when it comes to Black people of color, Black people, LGBT people. You're dealing with a system that's determined to keep itself operational.
I'd add to that about a system that's set on keeping itself operational. I like that phrase. That the prison emerged as a project of reform. That's the kind of key insight about from historians of the prison. It was a way to reform the violent public spectacle of dismembering people in public as a form of punishment in Europe. So the prison was supposed to be gentler in its kind of 17th century and 18th century forms. We see the constant effort to reform it actually just changes its violence. And I'll give you a concrete example from like 5 years ago. LA County, at the behest of many transgender activists who said exactly what Evie was talking about, and Ilan, about transgender people being put in solitary confinement, quote unquote, for their protection, built a separate jail for transgender people. So there's now, out of an effort to reform and make prison or jail more, quote unquote, safe for trans people, there's now just a prison for trans people in LA. And that is a reform. So actually the effort to make it better has made it worse, because now you have to raise money for that prison, or they already did, but you had to raise $60 million for it. Then you have to staff it. Then you have to keep funding it. And then you got to fill it. And then you need laws to fill it. So the effort to make it better actually keeps making it worse. And that's actually the history of the prison itself. The effort to end certain forms of violence against people labeled criminal gave rise to the prison. So there's something where we keep not getting to the root of it. And I think Evie is right that gets to the animus of it, or the point of it. The point is to keep the violence going, right? This is what Angela Davis and Ruth Gilmore and a lot of scholars of the prison and activists say is the point of it is to warehouse disposable people. So we need to create a system that doesn't need to do that anymore. And it's gonna take something much bigger than like building a jail for trans people, or Priya, obviously, or these other efforts at reform. We need a much larger effort at transformation, which is what I was trying to say about kind of, I was telling a kind of false story, but you know, there was a kind of radical revolutionary politics in the 70s that dissolved in the 80s. And there was a really different picture about how transforming the world would look. And it wasn't based on reform.
If I might add,
yeah,
one thought, the combination of disposable people and profit is what's keeping the system alive. When you build a jail, you're paying the builder. When you staff a jail, you're paying staff. When you put these prisons in the middle of nowhere in a rural city that had no income, you're creating economic opportunity for a little rural town of 3,000 people that can now build a hotel for visitation, build a restaurant to feed the visitors. So you have, you know, Isabel Wilkerson's cast will describe systems on systems on systems. And the problem is we can't catch up to them. We cannot. They are able to marginalize and control the profitability. That's why this slope into correctional control is something we have to focus on, because people understand that decarceration is going to happen, not entirely, but while we have our eye over here, the profiteers have their eye over here.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for just one quick question. Mackenzie, could you unmute yourself and ask your question real quick?
Yeah, definitely. This is for anyone or everyone. But what would each of you say is the biggest question that you're currently thinking about or goal that you have right now when it comes to mitigating the harm perpetuated against incarcerated queer people?
Revolution.
Yeah.
There is, as a child of two people who survived the Holocaust, you have to understand that for me, prison is just like another form of genocide of its own. Then the world perpetuates one genocide. While we're living here in America, there are at least 10 countries where genocide is happening. We like to kill, we like to torture. We are not who we think we are. And we like power. And you have to change the world. This is not about changing one jail, closing one jail. You have to undermine, dismantle, completely throw out the system, and that's going to take a lot more people than we have working on it.
I think one more thing, which was already mentioned, but is the lack of attention in LGBT advocacy groups. And I definitely, in my research, try to include and disseminate it and the results. And it's very hard to get the attention of LGBT advocates because I think there is a certain sense that if they take this side of LGBT offenders, quote unquote, they're going to be themselves somehow stigmatized by that. And they don't want to highlight that. And especially when it comes to, again, quote unquote, sexual offenders, because of the association of pedophilia and gay, and they don't want anything to do with that. They want to stay away from that. And we're not going to get to this revolution that Evie is talking about, or even any kind of reform, if our advocates don't pay attention to that. And so I hope as a researcher at the law school to be able to promote greater understanding and greater engagement in our community. And it's not just the advocacy groups, it's actually the people who are members of our community who also stay away from that and also vilify themselves, some of these people who are incarcerated and kind of want to distance themselves from that.
I'll just very quickly, I think we're past time, but I'll just very quickly say, I'll echo Evie, but also say sometimes in these moments, I also think of like really practical things, which are one, universal healthcare, free college. I have students who turn to criminalized forms of work because they can't afford college. So free college would solve that. Universal healthcare would solve the massive debt from healthcare. Basic a wage for being a human being. Many countries do that. That would solve all sorts of issues. These are actually quite practical, simple things that are done in many places across the world. And most of the countries in the world do not do this, what we do. So there's also kind of a myopia to many of us in America that this stuff, the brutality we accept and live with becomes normal. I'll just say quickly, like 15 years ago in Canada, they raised tuition for college students by $100. And students across Canada rioted and burned down buildings over $100. It's called the Maple Revolution. And here, when I was in college, tuition went up every year by $7,000. So there's just like, there's a level of just violence and dehumanization and that we just accept, I think. And we forget that there's models both historically in the past. Prisons have not always existed. And currently, mass incarceration does not exist in many places that we can turn to really quite practically. And we can hold on to Evie's revolutionary spirit.
Thank you so much. And before we end, I just wanted to send in the chat a link to a YouTube video about sexual violence in confinement that Evie wanted to share with you guys. It can be quite triggering, so please watch at your own discretion. However, it is extremely enlightening and important. So if you would like to watch it, please feel free to copy and paste that link and save it. So thank you guys so much for participating in our queer incarceration panel hosted by NPEP and UPEP. And thank you so much to our panelists for coming, and Jennifer as well, for being willing to share your knowledge and experiences with our Northwestern and wider community. And I hope everyone has a great and wonderful rest of their evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you.